They hit her in front of everyone. At church until a quiet cowboy hugged her. Without saying anything then, what happens next will shock you. Before we continue this story, let us know where you are watching from, if you enjoy stories like this, and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The first hit tore her shirt. The second hit tore her skin, but she still didn't cry out. Clara Gray stood with no shoes on in the dirt outside St. Vincent's Church, while the preacher's belt came down like it was a gift to God himself. Her arms were tied to the wood beam of the horse post. Her head was down, not because she was ashamed, but to hide the angry fire still burning in her eyes. The crowd had come together fast. Town people who wouldn't look at her yesterday now stood holding their breath and watching like they deserved to see this show. She did bad things. The preacher yelled between hits, for being wicked and telling lies. The woman beside the sheriff nodded. The mayor's wife wiped her eyes. No one stepped forward, not even when the sixth hit made blood thick enough to make the church steps wet. Clara had always been different, too smart, too proud, too unwilling to beg. She ran her father's old metalworking shop after he died, and didn't smile when men called her sweetheart. The town never liked that. Then the boy came, a banker's son who snuck into her bed with quiet promises and clean hands. He left 2 weeks. Later she stayed, and when her belly began to grow big, the punishment came. She was 27, not married, and not sorry. That was enough. The preacher raised his hand for the 7th time, and that's when the quiet changed. Not from Clara, not from the crowd, but from the edge of the square, where a man in a dusty long coat stepped forward and didn't stop walking. He had no badge, no gun, no reason to belong, but he walked straight through the people like they weren't there. The preacher stopped. Clara lifted her head. Blood was on her lip, hair was messy. Her eyes locked on the stranger, not begging, but knowing. She didn't know him, but something in her body did. He stepped onto the church steps, reached for the knot in the rope, and untied it without saying a word. No one moved, not even the sheriff. When her arms fell free, she fell down. He caught her as she fell, held her like he'd done it before, like this was the reason he was born. And still he said nothing. He just wrapped her gently in his coat and stood between her and the town. They never heard him speak, and she never had to. They didn't follow him. Not one person from the church dared. The cowboy walked with Clara in his arms, her blood soaking through his coat, his boots steady against the dry, cracked street that had never seen a man like him. She wasn't awake, just drifting in and out. Her lips were open, eyes fluttering like someone half between pain and a dream. But her fingers barely curled and held onto the edge of his collar like she knew she was finally safe. He didn't take her to the doctor. He didn't ask for help. He walked to the edge of town, past the metal shop, past the water well, to the little house where the widow Grafton once lived, long since empty and left to fall apart. He kicked the door open and laid her gently on the small bed inside. He took off the torn shirt and cleaned the cuts with water from his own water bottle. His hands were careful but soft, like he'd done this before, like he'd carried broken things that deserved more than the world had given. When she woke up, it was dark. The coat still lay over her, heavy with his smell, earth, tobacco, and something, faintly, like sage. Her back hurt. Her lips were swollen, but her mind was clear. She sat up slow, holding the coat to her chest, and looked around. He was there, just a few feet away, sitting on the floor beside the door, hat pulled low, watching her with eyes the color of evening. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice was cracked. It didn't seem to bother him. He just tilted his head slightly, then looked down at his hands. She tried again. "You don't even know me." He said nothing. He just took a deep breath, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a strip of leather, torn, weathered, but sewn at the edge. He held it up. She knew it right away. Her father's marking strap, the one he used on every finished horse. She hadn't seen it in years. She gasped. "Where did you get that?" The man finally looked her dead in the eye. And for one long second, she saw something flicker behind his quiet. Not fear, not pity, but something closer to memory. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The strap lay across his hand like a question. Only she could answer. Clara reached for the strap like it might burn her. The sewing was still there, her father's initials on one side. The faint star he'd carved on a drunk Sunday cut into the edge. It wasn't just a tool. It was family history. "This was lost in the fire," she said, her voice thin and not believing. "I looked for it for weeks." The cowboy's face didn't change. He set it gently on the table beside her, then leaned back, His quiet was heavy with something that filled the room more than words ever could. "Did you know him?" she asked. "My father." He blinked once, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, creased yellow, barely holding together. He slid it across the table. Her hands shook as she opened it. It was a drawing, rough charcoal, smeared but clear. Her father laughing, holding a little girl on his shoulders. She covered her mouth, tears springing up too fast to stop. "Who are you?" she whispered. He pointed to the bottom corner of the paper, a name written there. M. Grafton. Her breath caught. Miriam Grafton's boy. The cowboy gave the tiniest nod. Clara remembered her, the widow who lived outside town. The one folks said took in every lost human or animal. Died during the flood. People said no family ever came to bury her. But she had a son, and that son had drawn this. "You watched us," Clara said, shocked. "You were there that day." He nodded again. "Why didn't you say something back then?" Still, he said nothing. She looked at him, truly looked this time, at the way his jaw got tight when he breathed, at the scar that split his eyebrow like a forgotten word. He hadn't come to rescue her. He'd come to return something, a memory, a kindness, a truth no one else had carried. "You saw me before they did," she said quietly. "And now you're here again." His eyes met hers. They didn't need a sentence, just a quiet, deep enough to hold all that had never been said. Outside, the wind changed. And for the first time in days, Clara didn't feel ashamed of the name she carried. When Clara stepped outside the house the next morning, the air got tight. Dust curled around her bare ankles, like it too was waiting to see what she'd do next. The church bell rang, far away and cold. She wore her father's old coat now, patched at the elbows, and beneath it, bandages pressed against healing skin. The silent cowboy followed her out, but kept his distance, following her like a promise no one else had the courage to make. The town had expected her to disappear, crawl away in shame, maybe run to the next county like the others who were marked before her. That's what women did after the belt disappeared. Hid, broke. But Clara didn't. She walked to the metal shop with her chin high, unlocked the door with a rusty key, and lit the fire like she had every morning before the boy with clean hands ruined everything. Flames roared to life. She fed them with scrap metal and coal that had waited too long for someone to believe they were still useful. By noon, people began to appear, not to help, not to speak, just to watch. The mayor's son crossed the street, caught sight of her at the big hammer, and turned white as paper. He didn't wave. He didn't stop. She let him walk. He'd said nothing when she was dragged into the square. He didn't deserve a word now. But what made him stumble wasn't just her. It was the man beside her, hammering slowly at a blade's sleeves. Rolled to the elbow, scars visible and quiet, like truth carved into skin. He never looked up, never asked for money. But he stood beside her the whole time. The same beat in his swing as hers. As if they'd learned the rhythm from the same fire. When a child came near with wide eyes and a copper coin, Clara took it gently, and handed the boy a horseshoe she'd carved with a single star. The same star that lay sewn into the strap her father once owned. The child smiled and ran off. Clara didn't smile back, but her eyes got softer. And when she looked toward the cowboy, he finally met her look steady and proud. She wasn't the story the town wanted anymore. She was the story it couldn't ignore. Called him the Silent One, long before he ever held Clara. No one knew his name. No one remembered when he came. But after that morning at the metal shop, the town learned how loud a man could be without saying a word. When the saloon's piano broke, he fixed it with 3 nails and a wire pulled from his saddlebag. When the blacksmith's air blower cracked, he built a new one with wood taken from the church fence. He never charged, never nodded, just worked out, and still no one dared come near him without a reason, except Clara. She spoke around his quiet like it was a language only she understood. "You want coffee or tea?" she'd asked, putting both cups down without waiting. He always picked coffee. "You were a left-handed shooter, weren't you?" she asked one evening, noticing the way his right wrist had the deep twist scars of a healed break. He didn't jump, just raised his left hand, pretended to draw a gun, and let it rest on the table between them. "What happened?" she asked. His fingers tapped 4 times, then a pause, for again. Morse code, a habit her father once taught her to watch for TRP. That's what he spelled. She blinked. "You trusted someone." He looked away. The message had been enough. And that was how he told stories, in hand movements, in pauses, in tools, fixed in buttons sewn, and horses calmed. Clara didn't need more, not from him. One night she brought out the box of things they'd saved from the fire years. ago, things she hadn't touched since her father died, letters burnt at the edges, a photo with her mother's face faded but still smiling, a coin from the ward up. The cowboy sat beside her, picked up each piece like it belonged to him too. And when he reached the last thing, a burnt silver thimble, he closed her fingers around it and looked at her like the quiet had finally said enough. She didn't cry. She just nodded, because when the world had yelled at her, punished her, and turned away, this man had held her without noise, without questions. And somehow that quiet had rebuilt more than any sorry could. It was nearly evening when the knock came sharp, purposeful, and wrong. Clara stood from the metal shop stool, wiping black dust from her hands as the cowboy stepped ahead of her, hand resting lightly on the knife tucked behind his belt. The door creaked open to show Reverend Alder, boots polished, collar starched, no trace of the man who'd swung the belt before God and a watching town. "I've come to speak," he said, voice clipped but low. The cowboy didn't move. Clara stepped forward. "To speak," she repeated, "or to ask forgiveness." The preacher looked past her into the dark corners of the house. "There are rumors, whispers, of your defiance. The townsfolk are unsettled." "Are they?" she said coolly. "I wonder why." He moved uncomfortably. "Your return to the metal shop. The man beside you. The boy you carried, ... Stop there." Her voice snapped sharp as a hammer's hit. "You gave up the right to speak of him the moment you raised your hand, instead of your heart." The preacher's jaw got tight. "I acted on scripture. You acted on fear." She folded her arms, felt the cowboy's presence just behind her, quiet, grounded, unmovable. "You punished me to make others stay silent. And yet here you are," he muttered, "still standing, because someone chose to hold me when no one else would." The Reverend's eyes flicked to the man at her side, something bitter flashing across his face. "He's not of this town. Neither am I anymore," she replied. "I've outlived its judgment." The preacher sighed, stepped back. "Pride is a sin, Miss Gray. And cowardice is a sickness," she said. "One I've stopped catching." He left without blessing her, without sorry, without even saying her name. But Clara smiled as she shut the door, because for once she hadn't needed his permission to speak. The cowboy met her eyes, lifted one eyebrow slightly. "He won't come back," she said. The man reached into the fire's ashes, pulled a red coal with the metal tongs, and pressed it gently into the iron that would make her new brand. One not of punishment, but of choice. And for the first time in her life, Clara Gray would carry a mark that meant she belonged to no one but herself. By the end of the week, Clara's name had turned from whispered shame to clenched jaw warning. Men passed her on the street and tipped their hats, not out of politeness, but because they didn't want to meet her eyes. The same mouths that called her bad woman now muttered witch, or marked, like quiet, had turned her dangerous. Maybe it had. Maybe the absence of her sorry was louder than any sermon. She walked beside the cowboy every evening, past the well, through the market, sometimes hand on her belly, other times resting against his arm, like it had always been her place. He still never spoke, but folks talked enough for both of them. At the general store, the clerk fumbled the change, wouldn't meet her look. At the saloon, two ranch hands stopped mid-drink when she entered for sugar, as if seeing her unbroken threatened something they'd told themselves about women like her. And the worst of them all, Annabelle, the banker's niece, spoke loud enough for the front porch to hear. She didn't even say thank you. He risked his name for her, and she walks like she earned it. Clara turned slow and steady and stared straight through her. "He didn't give me anything I didn't already own," she said. "He just made it visible." That shut the porch up. The cowboy stood behind her, arms crossed, unmoved. His quiet was louder than fists. Later that night, as they sat on the porch swing, she'd rebuilt herself. She turned toward him and asked, "What do you see when they look at me like that?" He didn't answer with words. He reached into his pocket and handed her something wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it slowly. It was a broken nail, bent, burned, reshaped into a ring. Not perfect, not polished, but made in fire and shaped by patience. Her fingers shook. "This is ... She couldn't finish. He simply nodded. Not a proposal, not a claim, but a gesture. "You are not too ruined to be held." Clara didn't cry. She never had for pity, but her eyes shone, and she slipped the ring onto her finger without ceremony. The world had tried to silence her, but this man had taught her that quiet could be strength too, if it came from choice. And in that quiet, she had finally begun to speak. The storm rolled in like it had a purpose. Low skies, sharp wind, and thunder, That sounded more like memory than weather. Clara's baby pains began just after dark. No warning. But the way her hand grabbed the edge of the table and didn't let go. The cowboy didn't jump. He built the fire higher, boiled water, stripped the bed with practiced hands. He didn't speak. He didn't pace. He just nodded when she said, "It's time," and stood beside her with the same stillness he'd offered from the first day. The wind howled, like the town itself was trying to unmake her. But Clara didn't scream. She bore down, sweat soaking her forehead, blood warming the blankets. And when her voice finally broke, when she cried out not from pain but from power, he was there, hands steady beneath her knees, catching a life she had never once believed she'd earn. A boy, red-faced, angry, alive. Clara laughed, breathless, broken open in every way a woman can be, and pulled the child to her chest. "He looks like me," she whispered. The cowboy reached forward, brushed the baby's cheek with the back of his knuckle. And for the first time she saw his mouth form something, close to a smile. "Will you name him?" she asked. He shook his head. She understood. This boy would carry no man's shame, no memory of a father who ran, no stain from the preacher's lash, only fire and quiet and the steady silence of a man who had chosen to stay. "Then, I'll name him after the wind," she said, "because it never breaks, even when the sky does." She didn't sleep that night. Neither did he. They took turns holding the child, rocking him with no lullaby but the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of thunder fading into dawn. Outside, the storm passed. The streets were washed clean. The town would whisper again, would invent new names for what they saw in her, but Clara wouldn't hear them. Not anymore. She had built something louder, a life, a home. A child who came into this world wrapped, not in shame but in the warmth of a man who never said a word, but meant everything. 3 weeks after the birth, Clara returned to the town square, not to prove anything, not to face ghosts, but because she wanted a lemon drop from the store and refused to live like a runaway in her own skin. She wore her hair loose, the child tied to her chest, and the silent man walking beside her with his usual slow, sure walk. People moved out of their way, not with hate but with hesitation, like giving space to a force of nature they couldn't understand. Outside the church, the doors stayed shut. No bell rang. No sermon echoed. Reverend Older hadn't spoken her name since the day she stood again. Rumor had it he'd asked to move to a town in the east. Others said he stayed but never preached of women again. Either way, she passed without stopping. She owed no prayer to walls that once punished her body in God's name. A child waved from the bakery window. Clara smiled. The small things were beginning to return. Later that evening, she laid the baby down beneath the cotton blanket she'd sewn from her father's shirts and watched the way he slept, mouth open, hands curled like he was still holding her heartbeat. "You'd think he'll understand?" she asked, not looking up. The cowboy didn't answer. He sat near the fire, carving something small between his fingers. She crossed the room, watched silently as the shape came out. A horse, not perfect but familiar. "My first toy was just like this," she said, tracing the grain. "My father made it the night my mother died." The cowboy looked at her, eyes soft beneath the shadow of his hat. She placed the carving beside the sleeping child, then turned back to him. "What you gave me," she said slowly, "wasn't rescue. It was a place to return to when no one else waited." He rose slowly and took her hand. For a moment, neither moved. There were no promises, no claims, but in that shared quiet, there was a steady pulse of something whole. He brushed his fingers against her cheek. She leaned into it, and outside, as twilight fell across the house and the metal shop grew quiet, the town forgot how to define her, but she remembered who she was. Years later, they would whisper about her like she'd been a myth. Some said she cast spells from her metal shop. Others said the cowboy who followed her like a shadow wasn't real at all, just a ghost made from her shame. But those who met her eyes, truly met them, knew the truth. She'd been broken publicly and rose without permission. Not because someone fought for her, but because someone had stood beside her and refused to look away. The boy grew tall with her eyes and his silence. He'd asked once, when he was 9, why no one ever spoke the cowboy's name. Clara had smiled, kissed his head, and said, "Because names don't make a man real, deeds do." On her final day in the metal shop, she sealed one last iron brand, just a circle, unbroken, joined at both ends, and hung it above the door. Not for sale, not for use, just a symbol that even what's scarred can be whole. She didn't speak much in those years, not like before. She didn't need to. The world had heard her scream once, Then it heard her rebuilt. When she passed, it wasn't in a bed or under watch. It was in her swing, child asleep on her lap, sun dipping behind the chapel she no longer feared. And beside her still sat the man who had never spoken a word. His hand rested on hers. His eyes never closed. When they buried her, no priest was called, just townfolk with their hats in their hands, uncertain of what to say. But the boy spoke. She wasn't shamed. She was sacred. And with that, he placed the broken nail ring, now worn thin, into her palm. They say the cowboy vanished after that, walked past the hills, never looked back. But the swing remained. So did the metal shop, and the brand above the door. Because the town didn't build her legacy. She did. Not with noise, not with rage, but with silence, chosen, steady, sacred. She had been whipped in front of the church. But she had been held, truly held, by someone who didn't need to explain why she was worth it. And in the end, that was the loudest thing of all. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Echoes of the West, and tell us in the comments, can silence say more than any promise?